October 12th, 1944, 6:40 in the morning, a railway siding in Yorkshire, England. Private Vera Hartman stepped from the confines of a cattle car into the persistent drizzle of English rain. His hands were bound, his body weary from 3 days of arduous transit, a journey that spanned the English Channel and then wound through the countryside. Around him, 200 German prisoners were being guided into formation. These men, members of the 352nd Infantry Division, had been captured after weeks of intense combat in Normandy. They harbored grim expectations of their British captors, their minds filled with the explicit warnings disseminated by propaganda. The British Empire, depicted as a structure built upon colonial brutality, was expected to show no leniency towards German prisoners. The broadcasts from Berlin had been unequivocal. Beatings, starvation, and forced labor leading to death were to be anticipated. The message was clear. It was preferable to perish in combat than to endure the fate awaiting captured soldiers at the hands of the British. Vera scanned his surroundings, searching for the brutality he had been promised. Instead, he observed an unexpected sense of order. British guards were standing in precise formations, their rifles held correctly, their uniforms immaculate despite the inclement weather. There was no shouting, no disorder, only a quiet, professional military discipline that uncomfortably reminded Vera of the standards upheld by his own shattered division, standards they had abandoned during their desperate retreat across France. A British sergeant approached, a middle-aged man with a steady gaze that conveyed a sense of having witnessed the full spectrum of war and remained entirely unimpressed. He addressed them in German, his accent discernible yet perfectly comprehensible. "You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the camp. Anyone who causes trouble will be disciplined. Anyone who cooperates will be treated correctly. Is this understood?" His tone was neither cruel nor benevolent. It was simply factual, the manner of soldiers addressing soldiers. Vera found himself nodding in assent before he fully registered that he was accepting orders from the enemy. The search was thorough but not degrading. Personal belongings were catalogued and stored. Wounded prisoners were segregated for immediate medical attention. Then came the water. British soldiers moved along the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who had been their adversaries mere days before. Vera drank, the water cool and pure, and with a disquieting clarity realized that his initial experience of British captivity stood in stark contrast to every warning he had received. There were no beatings, no starvation, only professional military procedure executed with the calm efficiency that characterized all things British. As trucks began to arrive, tasked with transporting them to the camp, Vera overheard two British guards conversing in English, a language he partially understood. One remarked about "poor bastards," and the other responded, "Jerry or not, they're soldiers. Treat them accordingly." That phrase, "treat them accordingly," would come to define Vera's subsequent 18 months of captivity in British hands, instilling in him uncomfortable truths about the regime he had fought for and the civilization he had been conditioned to detest. The British prisoner of war camp system was founded on principles that meticulously balanced security with a fundamental respect for prisoners as human beings. By 1944, Britain was holding over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners in camps dispersed throughout England, Scotland, and Wales. The system operated under explicit directives. Prisoners were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, employed within legal parameters, adequately fed, properly housed, and disciplined firmly yet equitably. This was not an act of sentimentality. It was a calculated policy with multifaceted objectives. Security. Well-treated prisoners presented fewer complications than mistreated ones. Intelligence. Cooperative prisoners furnished valuable information. Diplomacy. Appropriate treatment ensured reciprocal treatment for British prisoners in German camps. Morality. Britain was engaged in a fight for civilization, a struggle that necessitated maintaining civilized standards even towards adversaries. The British philosophy underpinning the treatment of German prisoners reflected deeply ingrained British military and cultural values regarding proper conduct, even in wartime. British guards, many of whom were veterans of campaigns in North Africa, Italy, or France, operated under clear guidelines that emphasized the maintenance of discipline without descending into barbarity. The cultural expectation was one of restraint. Superiority was to be demonstrated not through brutality, but through unwavering composure and adherence to established standards. Sergeant Major William Thompson, who oversaw guards at Camp 174 in Lanarkshire, articulated this philosophy succinctly. These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our comrades, bombed our cities, but they are prisoners now, which means they are our responsibility. We do not abuse them because we are not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. We don't need to beat men to show we've defeated them. The barbed wire does that. This restrained approach fostered distinct camp atmospheres. Guards maintained professional courtesy with prisoners without fraternizing. Orders were issued clearly and enforced consistently. Violations of camp rules resulted in disciplinary measures, typically confinement or the forfeiture of privileges, but never physical abuse. The contrast with the Nazi treatment of prisoners was absolute and intentional. Britain was actively demonstrating that a democratic civilization could uphold moral standards even under the immense pressures of war, thereby offering a pointed refutation of Nazi claims that democracies were inherently weak and decadent. The arrival experience for German prisoners entering British camps created profound cognitive dissonance. The initial days presented a stark divergence between expectation and reality. Vera Hartmann's transport arrived at Camp 174 in Lanarkshire on October 13th. The facility housed approximately 2,000 prisoners in wooden barracks, encircled by barbed wire and guarded by watchtowers. While not luxurious, the accommodations were weatherproof, organized, and clean. Processing was systematic. Documentation, medical examinations, assignment to barracks, and explanations of camp rules were all conducted in German, either by British personnel who had learned the language or through the assistance of interpreters. The efficiency of the operation was impressive and subtly unsettling. It was evident that Britain had anticipated holding a substantial number of German prisoners and had meticulously prepared for their arrival. The first meal served as an education. Vera had expected meager starvation rations, as the propaganda had promised the British would deliberately starve their German prisoners. Instead, dinner consisted of adequate sustenance: bread, stew with actual meat, tea, and even margarine. It was more food than Vera's unit had received during the final weeks of fighting in Normandy. "I couldn't understand it," Vera recalled in a 1987 interview. "We had been told that the British would treat us worse than animals. Instead, on the very first night, we were given more food than we had seen in weeks, slept in dry barracks with proper beds, and were not beaten or subjected to abuse. The disconnect between what we had anticipated and what we experienced was so profound that some prisoners believed it was a temporary measure, that the real brutality would commence once we had been softened up. It never came. The camp rules were posted in German and explained with clarity. Work assignments were mandatory unless medically excused. Cooperation was required. Defiance would be punished. Escape attempts would be thwarted. Successful escapees would be recaptured. Medical care was provided to all. Religious services were permitted. Letter writing was allowed, subject to censorship. No fraternization with guards was permitted. Discipline was maintained through orderly procedures. The rules were not gentle, but they were fair, applied equally to all prisoners without favoritism or arbitrary cruelty. The work program involved German prisoners being assigned tasks, primarily agricultural labor and reconstruction projects, which were legal under the Geneva Conventions and beneficial to Britain's war-strained economy. The assignments were practical, including harvesting crops, repairing farm buildings, clearing land, and working in forestry. Britain faced severe labor shortages due to millions of men serving in the military. German prisoners provided an essential workforce for agriculture and basic construction. The work was demanding but not intentionally cruel. Prisoners worked 8-hour days, received supplementary rations for their manual labor, and were provided with adequate tools and supervision. British farmers who supervised prisoner work details were instructed to treat them fairly, obtain honest work from them, but not to abuse them. Oberfeldwebel, Sergeant First Class, fighter Hans Schmidt, worked on a farm in Kent for 14 months. We harvested crops, repaired fences, helped with livestock. The work was hard. I was a clerk before the war, not a farmer, but it wasn't impossible. The British farmer who supervised us was stern but fair. He showed us how to perform tasks correctly, expected competent work, and did not tolerate laziness. But he also brought us tea during breaks and never raised his hand to anyone. It was honest work for honest treatment. This work program fostered unexpected interactions between German prisoners and British civilians. Farmers who initially regarded the prisoners with hostility often developed a grudging respect for men who worked diligently and behaved properly. Some prisoners even learned English through daily contact with their supervisors. On occasion, British civilians would share food or cigarettes, gestures that directly contradicted German propaganda depicting widespread British hatred for Germans. The medical care received by sick and wounded German prisoners provided another stark contradiction to propaganda narratives. Camp 174's medical facility was staffed by British Army doctors and nurses who treated German patients with the same professional standards applied to British soldiers. Wounded prisoners received surgical procedures, medications, and rehabilitation. Sick prisoners were given proper diagnoses and treatment. The medical care was competent and non-discriminatory. Werner Hartmann developed pneumonia during his first winter in captivity. The British medical officer prescribed sulfa drugs, bed rest, and extra rations. A British nurse monitored his recovery, adjusting his treatment as needed. Within 2 weeks, Vera had fully recovered. "They saved my life," Vera stated matter-of-factly. "I would have died from pneumonia without proper medicine. The British provided me with antibiotics, professional care, and the time to recover. They did not have to. I was an enemy prisoner, of no value to them. But they treated illness as a medical problem requiring a medical solution, not as an opportunity to let prisoners perish. That professionalism deeply impressed me. Medical statistics documented systematic care. Approximately 80,000 surgical procedures were performed on prisoners between 1944 and 1946. There were over 5,000 deaths from disease, a mortality rate of less than 0.03%, lower than the civilian population due to camp sanitation and medical access. Medications provided included antibiotics, pain relief, antimalarials, and vitamins. This medical care served British interests as healthy prisoners worked more effectively and caused fewer administrative problems. However, it also demonstrated that Britain valued human life, even when that life belonged to enemy soldiers. What most impressed German prisoners was not kindness, but the consistent, unwavering British restraint in circumstances where cruelty might have been understandable. British guards had valid reasons to harbor animosity towards German prisoners. Many had lost comrades to German weaponry. Some had witnessed the devastation wrought by the London Blitz or other bombing campaigns. They were aware of the horrific contents of concentration camps. Yet, they maintained a professional distance and provided fair treatment. When a British guard at Camp 174 struck a German prisoner during an argument, the guard was disciplined, reduced in rank, and reassigned. The camp commander explained to the assembled prisoners, "That man violated military discipline by losing control. In the British Army, we maintain standards regardless of circumstance. You will be treated correctly not because you deserve it, but because we demand it of ourselves." This self-discipline, treating prisoners properly because British standards dictated it, rather than because the prisoners earned it, was psychologically devastating to Nazi propaganda that portrayed democratic nations as weak. German prisoners could not interpret consistent fairness as weakness when it was clearly underpinned by military competence and unshakable authority. Sergeant Major Thompson summarized the philosophy. "These men fought for evil, yes. They killed our soldiers, yes, but we do not lower ourselves to their level. We demonstrate superiority not through cruelty, but through maintaining civilized standards that they abandoned. When a German prisoner sees British guards treating him fairly despite having every reason to hate him, that teaches him more about the strength of civilization than any beating could." The Christmas service in December 1944 brought an incident that crystallized the British approach to German prisoners. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas services, both Protestant and Catholic. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments, gathered for religious observances, and sang traditional hymns. On Christmas Eve, prisoners assembled for the Protestant service. They sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, in German. The melody drifted across the camp in the cold winter air. British guards standing watch outside paused and listened in silence. When the song concluded, several guards quietly applauded. One sergeant entered the barracks afterward and distributed cigarettes and biscuits, a gesture not required by regulations, but a manifestation of common humanity during the holiday season. Vera Hartman remembered the moment vividly. "We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by enemies we had tried to kill. The British guards could have mocked us or forbidden the service. Instead, they respected it. When that sergeant came in with cigarettes saying, 'Happy Christmas, lads,' I understood that something fundamental had changed. These were not the barbarians we had been taught to expect. They were civilized men treating defeated enemies with a dignity we had shown no one during the war. The Christmas service became emblematic of British camp policy, maintained security and discipline, but recognized prisoners' humanity within those constraints. It was neither cruel nor weak. It was simply decent. German prisoners were allowed to write letters home, creating opportunities for the collapse of propaganda to spread beyond the camps. The letters described adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions, directly contradicting Nazi broadcasts about Allied brutality toward prisoners. When families in Germany received letters stating that their captured relatives were healthy and treated correctly, it undermined remaining faith in Nazi pronouncements. Vera's letter to his wife in December 1944 stated, "I am well and healthy. The British treat us fairly. We work, we eat, we are not abused. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin about POW treatment." His wife, living in a bombed Hamburg, shared the letter with her neighbors. The information rippled through her community. If Nazi propaganda about prisoner treatment was false, what else were lies? The atomic weapons, the promises of miraculous victories, the justifications for continuing a hopeless war. British authorities understood the strategic value of these letters. Allowing prisoners to write home served intelligence purposes, enabling censors to learn about German morale and conditions and to achieve psychological warfare objectives. The letters undermined Nazi propaganda among German civilians. The transformation extended beyond the initial shock of humane treatment. Captivity in British camps fostered ideological transformations among many German prisoners who compared their treatment with Nazi principles. The transformation process was gradual. The initial shock at humane treatment gave way to grudging acceptance that the British were not the monsters propaganda had depicted. This opened up profound questions. If that propaganda was false, what else was a lie? The racial theories, the claims about Jewish conspiracies, the entire ideological foundation of the regime they had fought for. Hans Schmidt described his evolution in the camp. "I had time to think without constant propaganda reinforcement. I saw the British treating us fairly despite having every reason to hate us. I talked to other prisoners who admitted that Nazi ideology was bankrupt. I read British newspapers, heavily censored, but still providing information we had never received in Germany. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my understanding. I had fought for evil. I had believed lies. The British who defeated and imprisoned me were more honorable than the regime I had served." British authorities recognized this potential for transformation and eventually implemented formal re-education programs. However, many prisoners had already abandoned Nazi beliefs simply by experiencing British fairness in contrast to Nazi brutality. When German prisoners began repatriation in 1946 and 1947, thousands volunteered to remain in Britain temporarily to continue agricultural work. The British government, facing ongoing labor shortages, permitted prisoner volunteers to stay as civilian workers. Approximately 25,000 former German POWs remained in Britain through 1948, working on farms and in reconstruction projects while residing in civilian housing. Hans Schmidt was among them. "I had nothing to return to. My city was rubble. My family scattered or dead. Britain offered work, housing, and the possibility of rebuilding my life. Many of us stayed voluntarily. We had been treated fairly as prisoners. Perhaps we could build futures here as workers. This voluntary retention demonstrated the success of British policy. Prisoners treated fairly became willing workers. Men who had fought against Britain chose to remain and contribute to British recovery. The transformation from enemy prisoners to voluntary workers validated the theory that decent treatment fostered cooperation. The British self-image, the restrained, fair treatment of German prisoners, reflected and reinforced Britain's self-conception regarding national character and civilized values. Britain viewed itself as a bastion of civilization against barbarism, maintaining civilized standards in prisoner treatment even when dealing with enemies who had fought for an explicitly barbaric regime, confirmed this self-image. British fairness towards German prisoners demonstrated moral superiority more effectively than cruelty ever could have. This was not naive idealism, it was a calculated demonstration of civilizational strength. By treating prisoners properly, while Germans treated Allied prisoners and everyone else brutally, Britain proved which side represented civilization and which represented barbarism. Captain Robert Ashford, camp commander at Camp 174, articulated this clearly. We are fighting to defend civilization against Nazi barbarism. If we abandon civilized standards in how we treat prisoners, we have lost what we are fighting to preserve. Our restraint, our fairness, our adherence to rules, even when dealing with men who fought for evil, this proves we are right, and they are wrong more clearly than any propaganda could. The British treatment of German POWs represented a strategic victory beyond the military defeat of Nazi Germany. Britain demonstrated that civilization could maintain moral standards under the pressures of war. A democratic society could wage total war without abandoning civilized values. Victors could treat defeated enemies with dignity. These were not signs of weakness, but of strength, particularly for the German prisoners who experienced this firsthand. The lesson was undeniable. Britain had defeated them militarily, and it had defeated them morally, by showing that civilization meant more than Nazi propaganda had ever understood. Sergeant Major Thompson summarized it simply. We beat them fair and square. Then we treated them like soldiers rather than animals. We didn't do it because they deserved it. Most had fought for evil. We did it because maintaining civilized standards, even towards enemies, proves civilization's strength. That's how you win wars properly. Defeat them on the battlefield. Then show them what they were really fighting against by treating them better than their own government ever did. The enduring recollection for German servicemen interned as prisoners of war by the British, the vivid impression of equitable conduct amidst situations where harshness might have been anticipated, stood as formative moments. Ver Hartmann, whose life concluded in 2001, maintained correspondence with his former British captors for the duration of his existence. In an interview conducted in 1995, he shared his perspective, stating, "The British possessed every prerogative to subject us to barbarity. We had engaged them in combat, extinguished the lives of their servicemen, and lent our support to an administration responsible for heinous acts. Their moral compass would have unequivocally sanctioned retribution. Instead, they accorded us a steadfast and impartial demeanor, an experience that imparted a profounder understanding of civilization than 12 years of Nazi indoctrination could ever achieve." That self-control, that unwavering commitment to principles, even when confronting adversaries, represented genuine fortitude. I came to grasp the true essence of democracy and civilization, not through academic study, but through my confinement by individuals who embodied those very values, even towards those who had been their combatants. The subdued benevolence observed within the British prisoner of war camps, those waterlogged encampments, and for Great Britain, the adept administration of 400,000 enemy combatants, resulting in minimal fatalities and the eventual conversion of many into willing laborers and proponents of democratic ideals, served as irrefutable proof that civilized principles were not an indicator of vulnerability, but rather the bedrock of enduring success.